Margaret Ellis stood frozen on that wind-scarred platform in Rawlins, Wyoming, watching the man who'd promised her forever turn his back and disappear into the snow. 58 years old, one trunk, one shattered dream, and nowhere left to go. But when a quiet rancher with patched clothes and honest eyes offered her something no pretty words ever could, she'd have to decide. Would she let one man's cruelty define her, or would she finally claim the life she deserved? Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. The morning train to Rawlins pulled into the station with a scream of brakes that sounded like a warning. Margaret Ellis felt it in her bones. That metallic shriek cutting through the Wyoming winter, sharp as the wind that would greet her when she stepped onto the platform. She sat in the third-class car, hands folded over the worn leather of her traveling bag, watching frost patterns spread across the window like prophecies she couldn't read. 58 years old. The number sat in her mind like a stone. Not young, not by anyone's measure, but not finished either, not done, not yet. The letter was in her coat pocket, creased from 100 readings, Harold Vaughn's handwriting, neat and promising. A fresh start, he'd written. A partnership built on respect and shared purpose. Age matters less than character, and I suspect yours is considerable. She'd believed him. God help her, she'd believed every word. The conductor walked through the car, calling out stations. Rawlins! Rawlins, Wyoming! End of the line for some of you folks. End of the line. Margaret almost smiled at that. Wasn't that exactly what she'd been searching for? An ending to one life, a beginning to another. The life she'd left behind in Philadelphia had grown too small, too quiet, too full of empty rooms and emptier days. Her sister's house, where she'd stayed these past 3 years since Robert died, had been kind enough. But kindness wasn't living. Kindness was just waiting in a prettier cage. The train lurched to a stop. Around her, passengers began gathering their belongings. Miners heading to the camps. A young family with 3 children who'd chattered the whole journey. A salesman with cases of goods Margaret couldn't imagine anyone needing in a place like this. She waited, letting them file past, giving herself one more moment before everything changed. When she finally stood, her legs trembled. Not from fear. She'd taught herself years ago that fear was just another feeling, no more important than hunger or cold. You acknowledged it, then you kept moving. But anticipation, that was different. Anticipation lived in the space between heartbeats, in the breath before a door opened, in the second before a man's face told you whether your gamble had paid off or cost you everything. She stepped onto the platform, and the wind hit her like a living thing. It tore at her coat, pulled at her hat, tried to push her back toward the train as if the land itself was rejecting her. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that hadn't quite decided to fall. The town of Rawlins stretched before her, a collection of wooden buildings huddled against the elements, smoke rising from chimneys, streets carved into mud and ice. It looked like every frontier town she'd imagined, and nothing like the photographs Harold had sent. The platform was crowded with people, families reuniting, workers heading to jobs, merchants collecting goods. Margaret stood still in the chaos, one hand on her trunk, searching the faces for the man she'd come to meet. And then she saw him. Harold Vaughn stood at the far end of the platform, exactly where he'd said he'd be. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that looked new. His hat was polished, his boots spotless despite the mud and slush. He was handsome in that clean, careful way some men achieved, like a photograph, all surfaces and no depth. Their eyes met across the platform. She saw the recognition hit him, saw his gaze trace her face, taking in the lines around her eyes, the silver threading through her dark hair, the shape of a body that had lived 58 years and wore every one of them honestly. She'd told him her age in her letters. She'd been clear about that, brutally clear, because she'd learned that honesty was the only foundation worth building on. But seeing it was different than reading it. She watched his expression change. It was subtle. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. But Margaret had spent a lifetime reading men's faces, first as Robert's wife, learning when his factory was in trouble by the set of his jaw at breakfast, and then as a widow, learning which men at church meetings thought her age made her invisible and which ones thought it made her desperate. Harold Vaughn's face showed disappointment, clean, simple, crushing disappointment. He started walking toward her anyway because he was a gentleman and gentlemen kept their appointments even when they'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret picked up her trunk, heavier than she'd remembered, packed with everything she'd thought worth bringing to a new life, and walked to meet him. They stopped 3 feet apart, close enough to speak without shouting over the wind, far enough that they were still strangers. Miss Ellis. His voice was exactly as she'd imagined from his letters, educated, controlled, empty of warmth. Mr. Vaughn? She set down her trunk. Her back ached from carrying it, but she kept her shoulders straight. Thank you for meeting me. Of course. He looked at her trunk, then back at her face, and she could see him calculating, wondering how quickly he could end this, wondering what excuse would cause the least fuss. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Has there? It wasn't a question. In your letters, you were quite eloquent, quite vivid. I suppose I formed an impression that was perhaps... He trailed off, searching for the word that would wound least while still accomplishing his goal. Younger, Margaret supplied. Her voice was steady. She'd had practice at this, at keeping her face calm while everything inside her broke. Robert's funeral, her mother's last breath. The day her sister had suggested, kindly, that perhaps Margaret should think about what she'd do when she became a burden. You thought I'd be younger. I never specified an age preference. You didn't have to. You read my words and heard a young woman's voice, despite me telling you plainly that I was 58 years old. That's on you, Mr. Vaughn, not me. His jaw tightened. I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate traveling 800 miles on a gentleman's written promise only to be rejected before we've exchanged a dozen words. Margaret picked up her trunk again. It felt heavier now, weighted with humiliation and rage and a weariness that went bone deep. But I suppose we're both destined for disappointment today. Miss Ellis, please understand. I understand perfectly. She met his eyes, and in that moment she let him see exactly what she thought of him. Not with anger. Anger would have given him too much power. But with the cool, clear judgment of someone who'd just watched a man reveal himself as smaller than his letters suggested. I understand that you're the kind of man who builds castles in letters and burns them in person. I understand that you wanted a wife who'd make you feel young again, not a partner who'd challenge you to grow. And I understand that I just spent my last $70 on a ticket to meet a coward. His face flushed red. Now see here. No, you see here. Margaret stepped closer, and despite himself, Harold Vaughn stepped back. You don't get to waste a woman's time, money, and hope, then act wounded when she calls it what it is. You wanted honesty in your letters? Then have the spine to be honest now. You don't want me. Say it plain, and let me get on with finding somewhere to sleep until the next train east. For a moment she thought he might argue, might try to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his broken promise. But Harold Vaughn was, at his core, a man who valued appearance over substance, and making a scene on a public platform was apparently worse than abandoning a woman he'd invited across the country. The next eastbound train is Thursday, he said stiffly. The hotel is 2 blocks north. I'm sorry it didn't work out. He turned and walked away. Just like that. No offer to help with her trunk, no assistance finding lodging, no acknowledgement that he bore any responsibility for the situation he'd created. He simply disappeared into the crowd of people moving through the station, his polished hat bobbing above the others until it vanished around the corner of a building. Margaret stood on the platform, trunk at her side, watching the space where he'd been. The wind picked up, carrying the first flakes of new snow. The platform was emptying now, people hurrying to get out of the cold. The train behind her hissed and groaned, preparing for its next journey. She could hear the conductor calling final boarding for passengers heading east to Cheyenne. She could get back on. She had just enough money left for a ticket, if she was careful. She could go back to Philadelphia, back to her sister's house, back to being the widow who took up space in the spare bedroom and tried not to be too much trouble, back to being the woman who'd gambled on a new life and lost. The station clerk leaned out his window, a thin man with a drooping mustache and kind eyes that had seen this scene play out before. Next eastbound train is Thursday, ma'am. 3 days. Hotels 2 blocks north, I heard. Margaret looked down at her trunk, then up at the gray sky, then at the town of Rollins spreading out before her. Thank you. You need help finding a place? I need to walk. She picked up her trunk one more time, muscles screaming in protest. I'll walk until I find something worth waiting for. The clerk nodded slowly. Town's not much, but it's honest. More than some men can say. Margaret almost smiled at that. I'll keep that in mind. She started walking. Not north toward the hotel. She couldn't bear the thought of sitting in a small room for 3 days, counting down the hours until she could escape her own humiliation. Instead, she walked west, deeper into town, past buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together in a hurry and expected to last forever. Past a general store with windows displaying tools and fabric and tin goods. Past a church with a crooked steeple and a graveyard full of wooden crosses. Past a saloon where music already played despite the early hour. The town watched her. She felt the weight of eyes from windows, from doorways, from people passing on the street. A woman alone with a trunk, walking with purpose, but no clear destination. That was the kind of thing people noticed in a place like this. She kept her head up, her shoulders straight. Let them look. Let them wonder. She was past caring what strangers thought. The livery stable sat at the edge of town, a large wooden structure with doors open to the street. Horses nickered inside, and she could smell hay and leather and the warm animal scent of the stables. A wagon stood outside, half loaded with supplies. And leaning against the post beside it, watching her approach with eyes that didn't judge, was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the buildings around him. You look like you're carrying more than a trunk, he said. Margaret stopped, set down her burden, looked at him properly. He was tall, raw-boned, somewhere in his 40s if she had to guess. His coat was patched but clean, his hat worn but cared for. His face was weathered the way faces got when they spent years in wind and sun, all hard lines and harder angles. But his eyes were steady, the kind of steady that came from seeing things clearly and not looking away. Depends, she said, and she was surprised by how tired her voice sounded. You offering help or judgment? Help doesn't cost a thing. He pushed off the post, moving with the easy economy of someone who never wasted motion. Judgment's too expensive for my taste. Smart man. Samuel Reed. He didn't offer his hand, not out of rudeness, she thought, but because he'd seen her trunk and knew her hands were occupied. You're the woman Vaughn was supposed to meet. It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. Was, past tense. Saw him walking back from the station. Man looked like he'd swallowed something bitter and blamed the cook. Samuel nodded toward his wagon. You need somewhere to go. I've got space. Not the hotel, and not charity, but it's warm, and nobody will bother you. Margaret studied him. She'd learned long ago that kind offers came in 2 varieties, the kind that expected payment in gratitude or submission, and the kind that were simply what they appeared to be. Samuel Reed's face told her nothing except that he meant what he said. Why? She asked. Why what? Why help a stranger? You don't know me. Don't know what I've done or where I'm going. For all you know, I could be running from the law. Are you? No. Then I don't care what you've done. And where you're going is your business. He glanced at the sky, where snow was starting to fall in earnest now. But right now, you're heading for a cold night with nowhere to stay, and I've got a spare room and a stove that works. Seems simple enough to me. Nothing's ever simple. No, he agreed. But some things are straightforward. You need help. I can help. Everything else is just noise. The snow fell harder, big wet flakes that stuck to her coat and melted on her face. Margaret thought about the hotel 2 blocks north, about 3 days of waiting in a strange town, about the long train ride back to a life that had stopped fitting years ago. And she thought about this quiet man with his patched coat and honest eyes, offering something no fancy letters or polished boots had managed. Simple human decency. Your name? He asked. Margaret Ellis. Well then, Mrs. Ellis. Miss Ellis. He picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing. Let's get you out of this weather before we both freeze standing here talking about it. She followed him to the wagon, and when he offered his hand to help her up, she took it. His grip was work-roughened and warm, and he didn't hold on a second longer than necessary. The wagon seat was hard wood, but there was a blanket folded there, and he shook it out and handed it to her without comment. They drove out of town in silence. Margaret wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and watched Rollins disappear behind them. The road, such as it was, wound through open country, past scattered homesteads and endless stretches of snow-covered grass. The wind pushed against them, making the wagon creak, and the horses tossed their heads. But Samuel drove with the relaxed competence of someone who'd made this journey 1,000 times. "You came west for him?" he asked after a mile of quiet. "I came west for truth," Margaret said. "Thought I'd found it in letters. Turns out truth looks different on paper than it does in person." "Usually does." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Man's a fool." "For lying?" "For not seeing what he had when it was standing right in front of him." Samuel kept his eyes on the road. "Takes a special kind of stupid to turn down a woman brave enough to cross the country on a promise." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some knot she hadn't even realized was there. That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me in years. Wasn't trying to be kind, just stating fact. They drove on. The snow fell steadily now, covering the world in white, muffling sound until there was nothing but the creak of wagon wheels and the soft breath of horses. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful in its emptiness, terrifying in its scale. Margaret had grown up in cities, where buildings and people pressed close, where you were never more than a few steps from help or trouble. This was different. This was space so vast it made her feel simultaneously insignificant and strangely free. Samuel's cabin appeared over a rise, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and a lean-to barn beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney, gray against the gray sky. It wasn't large, but it looked permanent, rooted, like it had grown from the land rather than being built on it. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, then offered Margaret his hand again. Her legs had stiffened during the ride, and she was grateful for his steadying grip as she found her footing in the snow. "Come on inside," he said, gathering her trunk. "We'll get you warm, then worry about everything else." The cabin's interior hit her with a wave of heat that made her eyes sting. The stove in the corner radiated warmth, its iron sides glowing faintly red. The room was simple: table, chairs, a bed in the corner, shelves holding supplies and books. Everything was clean but worn, used but cared for. It smelled of pine and coffee and wood smoke, masculine scents but not unpleasant. Samuel set her trunk beside the fire. "Stove's hot. Chair's yours. I don't ask questions after dark." Margaret looked around at the quiet room, at the fire dancing behind the stove's grate, at the window where snow pressed against the glass like it was trying to get in. She thought about Harold Vaughn's polished boots and empty promises. She thought about her sister's house in Philadelphia, all politeness and pity. And she thought about this stranger's simple offer: warmth, space, silence. "Good," she said softly, sinking into the chair by the fire. "I'm tired of answering them." Samuel nodded and moved to the stove where a pot of coffee sat warming. He poured 2 cups without asking, handed her one, and took the other to the window. He stood there, looking out at the snow, giving her space to breathe, to feel, to begin figuring out what came next. Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the heat seep into her palms. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the cabin's walls. But inside was warm. Inside was safe. Inside was a moment of peace she hadn't expected to find. "How long has it been?" Samuel asked quietly, still looking at the snow. "Since what? Since someone let you just be tired without needing you to explain why." Margaret stared at him, this strange, quiet man who seemed to see straight through to truths she barely admitted to herself. "Years," she said finally. "Too many years." "Then you can be tired here." He turned from the window, and his expression was gentle in a way that had nothing to do with pity. No explaining required. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Margaret Ellis let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, her gamble hadn't cost her everything after all. Maybe it had simply led her to a different prize than the one she'd been seeking. Maybe the end of Harold Vaughn's line was the beginning of something else entirely. She lifted her coffee cup in a small salute. To truth in person instead of on paper. Samuel raised his cup in response. To seeing what's actually there. They drank in silence while the snow continued to fall, burying the road back to town, burying the platform where she'd been abandoned, burying everything that had happened before this moment. And in that small cabin on a Wyoming ridge, Margaret Ellis began to understand that sometimes the journey doesn't take you where you plan to go. Sometimes it takes you exactly where you needed to be all along. The storm came in earnest that first night, howling down from the mountains like something alive and angry. Margaret woke to darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Not Philadelphia, not her sister's spare room with its floral wallpaper and the sound of carriages on cobblestone streets. Somewhere colder, emptier, more honest. Samuel's cabin. Wyoming, the end of one road and the uncertain beginning of another. She lay still on the narrow bed he'd insisted she take while he made do with blankets on the floor, listening to the wind tear at the walls and the occasional crack of ice against the windows. In the darkness, she could hear his breathing, steady, unhurried, the breath of a man accustomed to storms. It should have felt strange sharing space with a man she'd known less than a day. But somehow it didn't. Somehow his presence was just another constant in the room, like the stove's warmth or the smell of pine logs. You awake? His voice came quiet from the darkness. Hard to sleep through this. First real winter storm always sounds worse than it is. Cabin's solid. We'll be fine. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. You say that like you've weathered many of them. Built this place 8 years ago. Seen the worst this land can throw at a man. There was a rustling sound as he shifted in his makeshift bed. But I'm still here, cabin's still standing. That tells you something. Tells me you're either stubborn or crazy. Little of both, probably. She heard the smile in his voice. Most folks out here are. They fell quiet again, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the stove ticked as it cooled, and somewhere in the lean-to, the horses moved restlessly. Margaret closed her eyes and let the sounds wash over her, so different from city nights, from the clatter and voices and constant movement she'd known all her life. This was a different kind of noise, wilder, more raw, and surprisingly peaceful. When she woke again, pale gray light was filtering through the windows, and Samuel was already up, feeding logs into the stove. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried in white drifts that reached halfway up the cabin walls. Coffee's on, he said without turning. Snow's deep, but it'll pack down by afternoon. Can get you back to town tomorrow if you want. Margaret sat up, running her fingers through her hair, trying to tame it into something presentable. And if I don't want? He did turn then, spatula in hand, expression neutral. Then you're welcome to stay until you figure out what you do want. But I'm not a charity house, Miss Ellis. You stay, you work. I've got fence repairs that need doing before spring, mending that's piled up, barn that needs mucking. Can't pay cash, but I can offer room and board. You'd trust me with your fences? You made it this far on your own steam. Figure you can learn to mend wire. He went back to the stove where eggs were sizzling in a pan. Besides, trust's got to start somewhere. Might as well start with honest work. Margaret stood and moved to the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. Everything was softened under snow, all the harsh edges smoothed into gentle curves. It looked peaceful, deceptive. She knew enough about winter to know that beauty could kill you if you weren't careful. I'll stay, she said. For now, until I figure out what comes next. Fair enough. Samuel divided the eggs onto 2 tin plates and brought one to the table. But you should know something first. What's that? Town's gonna talk. Woman living out here with a bachelor rancher, no marriage, no chaperone. That's the kind of thing that gets tongues wagging. Margaret took her seat and picked up her fork. Mr. Reed, I'm 58 years old. I traveled 800 miles to meet a man who took one look at me and decided I wasn't worth the trouble. My reputation survived being widowed, survived living as a dependent in my sister's house, survived crossing the country alone. I think I can survive some gossip. Just wanted you to know what you're signing up for. I appreciate the warning. She took a bite of eggs, simple, well-cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper. But I stopped worrying about what people thought somewhere between Philadelphia and here. They ate in silence, and then Samuel showed her how he wanted things done. He wasn't a demanding teacher, just thorough, demonstrating once, watching while she tried, correcting when necessary, but never making her feel foolish for not knowing. By midday, Margaret had learned how to split kindling without losing a finger, how to feed the horses and check their hooves for ice, and how to read the sky for signs of another storm. "You're a quick study," Samuel said as they walked back from the barn, boots crunching in snow that came up to their knees. "I've had practice learning new things. When Robert, my husband, when he died, I had to learn everything. How to manage money, how to deal with his business partners, how to negotiate with creditors. Being a widow is an education nobody wants but everyone needs." "How long?" 3 years. Hart gave out one morning over breakfast. "Doctor said it was quick, if that's supposed to be a comfort." Margaret stopped and looked back at the tracks they'd left in the snow, 2 sets of footprints side by side, leading away from the cabin. "I thought I knew what alone felt like before that. I was wrong." Samuel nodded slowly. "I lost my wife 6 years back. Fever. Nothing the doctor could do except make her comfortable at the end." He started walking again, and Margaret fell into step beside him. "People kept telling me time would make it easier. They were half right. Time makes it different, not easier. You learn to carry it better, but the weight never really changes." "No," Margaret agreed quietly. "It doesn't." They reached the cabin and stamped snow from their boots before going inside. The fire had burned low, and Samuel set about building it up again while Margaret put water on for coffee. It struck her how easily they moved around each other in the small space, how naturally they'd fallen into a rhythm. Him tending the fire, her managing the stove, both of them working toward the same goal without needing to discuss it. This was what Harold Vaughn's letters had promised. Partnership. Shared purpose. 2 people building something together. But Harold had been selling a fantasy, all pretty words and no substance. This simple exchange of labor and silence, this was real. "Tell me about this town," Margaret said as they settled with their coffee. "What kind of place is Rollins?" "The kind that's still figuring itself out. We've got railroad workers, miners, ranchers, drifters, people from everywhere and nowhere. Some are running from something. Some are running toward something. Most are just trying to survive." Samuel cradled his cup between his palms. "It's rough, but it's honest. You'll find good people if you look, and you'll find trouble if you're careless. Same as anywhere, I suppose." "And you? Which category do you fall into?" "I came west after Sarah died. Couldn't stay in Ohio, couldn't look at the house we'd built, couldn't stand all those pitying looks from neighbors who meant well but made everything worse." He stared into his coffee like it held answers. "Figured I'd head to California, see the ocean, maybe find work on someone's ranch. Got as far as Rollins and ran out of money. Took a job at the livery, saved enough to buy this land, and here I am. Not running, not chasing, just being." "Just being," Margaret repeated. "That sounds like the most honest thing I've heard in a long time." The afternoon stretched quiet and productive. Samuel worked on repairing a harness while Margaret tackled the mending he'd mentioned. A pile of shirts with torn seams and missing buttons, work pants worn through at the knees, socks that needed darning. Her fingers remembered the motions from years of keeping Robert's clothes maintained, from the nights after his death when she'd mended and darned and hemmed, because it was something to do with her hands while her mind tried to process the enormity of being alone. They talked in fits and starts, sharing pieces of their histories the way people do when they're still deciding how much to reveal. Margaret learned that Samuel had been a school teacher before he married, that he could read Latin and do advanced mathematics but preferred the simple clarity of physical work. Samuel learned that Margaret had helped run Robert's textile factory after he got sick, that she had a head for numbers and no patience for fools, that she'd once fired a manager who'd been cheating workers out of wages. "You ran a factory." Samuel looked up from his harness work, surprised. Someone had to. Robert was brilliant with fabrics and dyes, but business bored him. "I kept the books, managed the workers, dealt with suppliers. After he died, his partners bought me out, gave me a fraction of what my share was worth, but I didn't have the strength to fight them." She bit off a thread and examined her work. "That money paid for my sister's hospitality and a ticket west. Now it's gone, and here I am." "Here you are," Samuel echoed. Broke, stranded, and sewing my shirts. I've been in worse positions. Name one. Margaret thought about it. Fair point. This is probably the worst position I've been in since... She trailed off, memory catching on something sharp. Since what? Since the night 3 men tried to break into the factory. I was there late, finishing the books. They thought the place was empty. She kept her eyes on her sewing, needle moving in and out in steady rhythm. I had Robert's pistol in the desk drawer. When they kicked in the door, I fired 2 shots into the ceiling and told them the next one would be lower. They ran. Samuel set down his work. You ever fire at a person? No, thank God no, but I learned that day that I could if I had to. She met his eyes. Is that something you want to know about the woman staying in your house? It's something that makes me glad you're here and not on the receiving end of whatever trouble might come. He picked up his harness again. Woman who can protect herself is a rare thing out here. Rarer still, in my experience. You sound like you've seen your share of trouble. Enough to recognize it when it walks through the door. As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats broke the afternoon quiet. Samuel's hand stilled on the leather, and his eyes went to the rifle mounted above the door. Margaret set down her mending and stood, moving instinctively away from the windows. Expecting someone? She asked quietly. No. Samuel rose and went to the window, peering out carefully. Single rider, don't recognize the horse. They watched as the rider approached, a man hunched against the cold, leading his horse rather than riding it. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the animal was limping badly. The man stopped 20 yards from the cabin and called out, "Hello, the house! I need help!" Samuel grabbed his coat and opened the door, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. "What's your trouble?" "Horse threw a shoe 2 miles back, been walking since. I'm about froze through." The man's voice was rough with cold and exhaustion. "Name's Elias Ward. I can pay for shelter, just need to get warm and tend my horse." Margaret joined Samuel at the door, studying the stranger. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, with a lean face and quick eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. His clothes were good quality but travel-worn, and there was something about the way he held himself, a coiled tension that didn't match his words. "You armed?" Samuel asked. "Just a pistol, for snakes and such." Elias spread his hands, showing them empty. "Look, I understand caution. I'm a stranger. It's getting dark. You've got a woman to protect, but I'm asking neighbor to neighbor. I need help." Samuel glanced at Margaret. She gave the smallest shake of her head, but he'd already made his decision. "Bring your horse to the barn. We'll see what we can do." "Thank you. Truly, thank you." Elias led his horse forward, limping almost as badly as the animal. Samuel turned to Margaret, voice low. "Keep the pistol close. Something about him doesn't sit right." "I noticed." Margaret went to her trunk and retrieved Robert's old revolver from where she'd packed it beneath her clothes. It was heavy and cold in her hand, familiar weight from those nights at the factory. "I'll keep watch." They took Elias Ward's horse to the barn while Margaret stayed in the cabin, gun hidden in her apron pocket, hand resting on the grip. Through the window, she watched Samuel show the stranger where to stable his mount, watched them examine the horse's injured hoof, watched the easy way Elias moved despite claiming exhaustion. He was lying about something. She couldn't prove it, couldn't name what exactly felt wrong, but her instincts, honed through years of dealing with dishonest men, were screaming warnings. When they returned to the cabin, Elias was all gratitude and charm. He accepted the coffee Margaret offered, praised the warmth of the fire, made small talk about the weather and the road conditions. But his eyes never stopped moving, taking in the layout of the cabin, the locations of weapons, the positions of doors and windows. "You're far from town for a woman," he said to Margaret, smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I like the quiet," she replied evenly. "Still, must get lonely or dangerous. These are wild lands." "I'm comfortable with wild." She met his gaze steadily. "And I stopped worrying about danger a long time ago." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. "I meant no offense, ma'am." "And I took none." Samuel intervened before the tension could escalate further. "You'll sleep in the barn. It's warm enough, and there's hay for bedding. We'll help you at first light. Either fix your horse's shoe or loan you a mount to get to town. That's generous, but that's how it is. Samuel's voice was firm, but not unkind. You're welcome to shelter and food, but the cabin's too small for three, and the lady deserves her privacy. Elias's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Of course, I understand, and I'm grateful for any help. They gave him blankets and another cup of coffee before sending him to the barn for the night. Margaret watched through the window as he crossed the yard, saw him glance back at the cabin before disappearing into the lean-to. He's not going to stay in that barn, she said quietly. I know. Samuel checked the rifle, then loaded it carefully. Question is whether he's just a thief looking for easy pickings or something worse. My money's on worse. Mine too. He set the rifle within reach and pulled his chair closer to the door. You should sleep. I'll keep watch. Mr. Reed, Samuel, if we're going to spend the night waiting for trouble, might as well be on first-name terms. Margaret almost smiled at that. Samuel, then. And I'm Margaret. She pulled her own chair to face the door, hand going to the pistol in her pocket. But I'm not sleeping while you keep watch. We'll take turns. Margaret, don't argue. I survived running a factory in Philadelphia. I can survive one cold night in Wyoming. She settled into her chair, gun resting in her lap. Besides, you said earlier that you wanted a worker, not a dependent. Well, workers pull their weight. This is me pulling mine. Samuel studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough, but if shooting starts, you get behind the stove. It's cast iron, best cover in here. Agreed. And if he goes for you, I'm aiming for center mass. Fair warning. Noted. Samuel almost smiled. You know, when I offered you a ride this morning, I wasn't expecting things to get quite this interesting. Welcome to my life. Things tend to get interesting whether I want them to or not. They settled into silence, watching the door, watching the windows, listening to the night sounds outside. The wind had picked up again, not as fierce as the previous night's storm, but enough to rattle the shutters and moan through the eaves. Perfect cover for someone trying to move quietly. Perfect excuse for sounds that shouldn't be there. Hours passed. Margaret's turn at watch, then Samuel's. The fire burned low and he built it up again. Coffee was made and drunk. Outside, the world stayed dark and cold and full of possibilities, most of them bad. It was deep into the night, during Margaret's second watch, when she heard it. A soft scraping sound, barely audible under the wind. The sound of someone testing the door latch. Her hand tightened on the pistol. Samuel. He was awake instantly, hand going to the rifle. They waited, barely breathing, as the latch lifted slowly. The door began to open, just an inch, then two, cold air spilling through the gap. Margaret raised her pistol, aimed at the opening door, and spoke clearly into the darkness. I suggest you rethink whatever you're planning, Mr. Ward. The door stopped moving. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Elias Ward's voice came from outside, different now, harder, stripped of its earlier charm. I just needed to get warmer. Barn's too cold. Barn has blankets and hay. That's warm enough. Margaret didn't lower her weapon. Door stays closed. You wouldn't shoot me just for trying to get warm. You're right. I wouldn't shoot you for that. She stood, moving to where she could see him through the gap in the door. But I would shoot you for lying, and we both know you're not out there because you're cold. Another pause, then, the money in his saddlebags. I saw it when I stabled my horse. Must be 3 months' wages there. That's all I want. Give me that, and I'll leave you both alone. No. Samuel's voice was flat, final. Be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Reasonable says a man who lies about needing help probably lies about only wanting money. Reasonable says you came here planning trouble, and now you're disappointed you didn't catch us sleeping. Samuel raised his rifle. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to back away from that door, go to the barn, get on your horse, and ride out. Do it now, while it's still your choice. Through the gap, Margaret saw Elias's face, saw the calculation there, the weighing of options. His hand moved toward his belt, where she could see the grip of a pistol. Don't, she said quietly. I've already got you in my sights, and at this range I won't miss. Neither will he. You might get one of us, but the other will put you down, and you'll bleed out in the snow with nobody to help you. That what you want? His hand stilled. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling through the gap in the door. Then Elias stepped back, hands rising slowly. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," Margaret replied. "You made the mistake. We're just refusing to pay for it." He backed away slowly, hands still raised, until he reached the barn. They watched him saddle his horse, working quickly despite the animal's injury, and mount up. He looked back at the cabin once, face twisted with anger and something uglier, then kicked his horse into motion and disappeared into the darkness. Samuel closed the door and threw the bolt. Margaret lowered her pistol, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking. "You all right?" Samuel asked. "Fine, just adrenaline." She set the gun on the table and flexed her fingers. "He'll tell people in town about me being here, about us refusing his hospitality. It'll make things harder." "Probably." Samuel set his rifle back in its place above the door. "But we'll deal with that when it comes. Right now, I'm more interested in making sure you really are all right." Margaret looked at him. This quiet man who'd taken her in without question, who'd trusted her instincts about a stranger, who'd stood ready to defend them both without hesitation. In the firelight, his face was all hard plains and shadows, weathered and honest and steady as the ground. "I'm all right," she said again, meaning it this time. "Better than all right, actually. It's been a long time since someone asked me that question and actually waited for the real answer." "Then I'm glad I asked." Samuel moved to the stove and put coffee on, because apparently that was his solution to every difficult moment. "Though I have to say, Margaret Ellis, you're hell of a lot more interesting than I expected when I offered you a ride yesterday." "Yesterday? Has it only been one day?" Margaret laughed, surprising herself. "Feels like longer." "Time moves different out here. Some days last forever, some weeks fly by." He poured coffee and brought her a cup. "But I'll tell you this. In all my years in this cabin, I've never had a night quite like this one. Sorry about that." "Don't be. Gotta see you handle yourself in a crisis. That tells me more about your character than a month of small talk would have." He raised his cup in a small salute. "To truth in action instead of words." Margaret touched her cup to his. "To seeing what's actually there." They drank, and outside the wind began to die down, and the darkness started its slow fade toward dawn. They'd survived the night, survived Elias Ward and his threats, survived the cold and the storm and the long hours of waiting. They'd survived together, and as Margaret sat in that small cabin with her coffee growing cold and the man across from her staring into the fire with tired eyes, she realized something had shifted. Yesterday she'd been a stranger accepting charity. Tonight she was something else. Partner, maybe. Friend, possibly. Someone who'd stood her ground when it mattered. Someone who'd proven herself not with words, but with action. "Thank you," she said quietly. Samuel looked up. "For what?" "For trusting me with that gun. For believing me when I said something was wrong. For treating me like a partner instead of a problem." She set down her cup. "For being the kind of man who does what he says and says what he means. That's rarer than you think. Out here, it's the only way to survive." But his expression softened, though I appreciate hearing it. "And for what it's worth, Margaret, I'm glad you're here. Glad I offered that ride. Glad you said yes. Even with all the trouble I seem to bring, especially with it." He stood and moved to the window, watching the sky lighten in the east. "You know what the problem is with living alone? Gets to where you forget what it's like to have someone at your back. Someone who'll stand with you when things get hard. Someone worth protecting." He turned back to her. "Been a long time since I had that. Forgot how good it felt." Margaret joined him at the window, watching dawn paint the snow in shades of pink and gold. The world looked new, clean, full of possibilities she hadn't let herself imagine yesterday. "You know people are going to talk," she said, echoing his earlier warning. "Woman staying here, no marriage, no chaperone. That story Elias tells will make it worse. Let them talk. It could hurt your reputation." "Margaret," he turned to face her fully. "My reputation survived being the strange Eastern schoolteacher who came west and went native. It survived Sarah's death and my grief and 6 years of living alone like some kind of hermit. I think it can survive people gossiping about a respectable woman staying in my spare room." He paused. "Unless it bothers you. If it does, I'll take you to town today, help you find proper lodging, and nobody will think less of you for it. She thought about the hotel in Rawlins, about 3 days of waiting alone, about the stares and whispers she'd face as the woman Harold Vaughn had rejected. She thought about going back east, about her sister's pitying looks and the endless empty days. And she thought about this cabin, this man, this unexpected sanctuary she'd stumbled into. No, she said firmly. If I'm going to be gossiped about, I'd rather earn it doing something worthwhile. And this, she gestured at the cabin, at him, at the life they were beginning to build in the space between words. This feels worthwhile. Good. Samuel smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his face from hard lines to something warmer. Then I guess we're partners in scandal. Welcome to the most interesting mistake either of us has made in years. Margaret laughed, full and genuine, the sound surprising her with its freedom. To interesting mistakes, and honest trouble, and whatever comes next. They stood at the window together, watching the sun climb higher, watching the world wake up around them. Somewhere in town, Elias Ward was probably already spreading his version of last night's events. Somewhere in Philadelphia, her sister was probably wondering why Margaret hadn't written. Somewhere in this very town, Harold Vaughn was going about his day, never knowing what he'd lost when he turned his back on the station platform. But here, in this cabin on this ridge in the endless Wyoming morning, Margaret Ellis felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly. That was too simple. Not contentment. That was too passive. What she felt was alive, present, real in a way that didn't apologize or explain or hide. She felt like herself again, like the woman she'd been before Robert died, before she became someone's dependent, before she learned to make herself small enough to fit in spaces that weren't meant for her. She felt like the woman who'd run a factory, who'd faced down intruders, who'd crossed a country on nothing but hope and stubbornness. She felt like someone worth knowing. What now? She asked. Samuel considered the question. Now we have breakfast, then we check the fence lines before the next storm hits, then we figure out dinner. Then we do it all again tomorrow. He met her eyes. Simple work. Honest days. One foot in front of the other until we get wherever we're going. Sounds perfect. And it did. It really did. The days that followed the stranger's departure settled into a rhythm Margaret hadn't expected to find. Not here, not with Samuel Reed, not in the aftermath of everything that had brought her to this ridge in Wyoming. She woke each morning to the sound of the stove being fed, Samuel moving through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd lived alone long enough to make silence comfortable. He never woke her deliberately, but his presence was enough. The creak of floorboards, the soft thud of wood being stacked, the smell of coffee brewing in the gray light before dawn. They worked together without planning it. Margaret would rise and dress behind the blanket Samuel had strung across the corner for her privacy, and by the time she emerged, he'd have breakfast started. Cornmeal mush or eggs from the chickens he kept in the lean-to, bacon when they had it, always coffee. They ate without much conversation, but the silence felt different now. Less like strangers avoiding words, and more like two people who'd learned that not everything needed to be said out loud. After breakfast, Samuel would head out to tend the animals, or mend fences, or do whatever work the ranch demanded, and Margaret would tackle the cabin. Not because he never asked, but because sitting idle made her feel like a burden, and she'd spent too many years in her sister's house feeling exactly that way. Here, at least, she could be useful. She swept floors and washed dishes and organized shelves that had clearly been organized by a man who cared more about function than order. She found a needle and thread in a drawer and spent an afternoon mending tears in his shirts that he'd probably stopped noticing years ago. On the third day after the stranger's visit, she was standing at the window kneading bread dough when Samuel came back early from checking the fence line. His face was tight with something she couldn't quite read. "Problem?" she asked. "Tracks," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Fresh ones, near the north property line. Boot prints, not animal." Margaret's hand stilled in the dough. "The man from the storm?" "Can't say for certain, but they circle the property like someone was watching the cabin." He moved to the window beside her, looking out at the white expanse. Could be nothing. Could be a drifter moving through. But it didn't feel like nothing. Your instincts telling you something? Always do. He glanced at her, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. I know you came here looking for peace, not trouble. I came here because a man lied to me and you offered help, Margaret said. Whatever trouble might be circling, that's not on me to apologize for. Wasn't asking you to apologize, just... He trailed off, searching for words. Just want you to know that if things get complicated, you're free to leave. I'll take you back to town. Make sure you have a safe place until the next train. No hard feelings. Margaret looked at him. Really looked at him. At the weathered face and steady eyes, at the man who'd taken her in without questions and defended her without hesitation when danger knocked on his door. At the only person in Rawlins, Wyoming who'd seen her as something other than a problem to be solved or a story to be pitied. Samuel Reed, she said slowly, are you trying to protect me or protect yourself? His jaw tightened. Bit of both, I suppose. Well, stop it. She turned back to the bread dough, punching it down with more force than strictly necessary. I'm 58 years old. I've buried a husband, raised a household, and traveled 800 miles on a broken promise. I think I can handle whatever trouble might be circling your property line. That's not the point. Then what is the point? She faced him again, flour dusting her hands. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to give me an exit before I decide I might actually want to stay. The words hung between them, sharp and surprising. Margaret hadn't meant to say them quite like that, hadn't meant to reveal how much she'd been thinking about staying, about the possibility that this temporary refuge might become something more permanent. But now they were out there, and she couldn't take them back. Samuel stared at her for a long moment. You want to stay? I don't know what I want, she admitted, but I know I'm not running from whatever's out there just because it might be inconvenient or dangerous. I've spent too much of my life making myself small and quiet so other people could be comfortable. I'm done with that. Something shifted in Samuel's expression, surprise maybe, or respect, or some combination of both. All right then, he said quietly, but we're keeping the rifle loaded and taking turns keeping watch at night. Agreed. They stood there in the kitchen, flour and tension thick in the air between them, and Margaret felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but something close to it. The feeling of being seen, of being heard, of standing her ground and having someone respect the space she claimed. Your bread's going to overproof if you keep staring at me instead of shaping it, Samuel said, and there was the ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Then stop giving me things to stare at, Margaret shot back, but she turned back to the dough, dividing it into loaves with practiced hands. That night, they took turns at the window. Samuel took first watch while Margaret slept fitfully in the corner, the rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. At midnight, he woke her with a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she took her position by the window while he stretched out on his bed, boots still on, ready to move if needed. The night was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. The wind had died down, leaving the world wrapped in a stillness that felt expectant, waiting. Margaret watched the darkness beyond the window, watching for movement, for shadows that didn't belong, for any sign that they weren't alone out here on this ridge. Nothing came. By morning, the tension had stretched thin but not broken. Samuel made breakfast while Margaret folded the blanket she'd used and tried not to feel the exhaustion pulling at her bones. They ate in silence, and then Samuel said, I need to ride into town today, pick up supplies, check if there's been any trouble reported. I'll come with you. Margaret, don't. She held up a hand. Don't tell me it's safer here. Don't tell me I should stay behind where I'll be protected. If there's trouble, I'd rather face it with you than face it alone. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But we go armed and we stick together. They rode into Rawlins in Samuel's wagon, the rifle tucked under the seat, Margaret's revolver, the one Samuel had discovered she carried and never questioned, hidden in the folds of her coat. The town looked different in daylight, less threatening but no more welcoming. People watched them pass with open curiosity, and Margaret could practically hear the gossip spreading in their wake. That's the woman Vaughn rejected, living with Samuel Reed now. Wonder what that's about. Let them wonder. She was past caring. Samuel pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, and they went inside together. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes, looked up from his counter and took in the sight of them, Samuel Reed and the Eastern woman, shopping together like they had every right to be there. "Morning, Reed," the man said carefully. "Morning, Fletcher. Need to pick up some supplies." "Of course." Fletcher's eyes slid to Margaret. "Ma'am." "Sir?" Margaret kept her voice cool and polite, the tone she'd perfected in Philadelphia when dealing with people who thought widows should be grateful for any attention. They moved through the store gathering what they needed: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition. Samuel handled the negotiations while Margaret examined the fabric bolts, not because she needed anything, but because it gave her somewhere to look that wasn't the stares of the other customers. "Excuse me," a woman's voice said beside her. Margaret turned. The speaker was perhaps 30, dressed well for a frontier town, her hair pinned neatly under a proper hat. Her face held curiosity, but not unkindness. "Yes?" "I'm Sarah Mitchell. My husband owns the hotel." The woman extended her hand and Margaret shook it, surprised by the gesture. "I wanted to welcome you to Rollins. I know your arrival was less than ideal. News travels fast. In a town this size, news travels before it even happens." Sarah smiled and it reached her eyes. "Harold Vaughn's an idiot, if you want my opinion. I didn't ask for it, but I appreciate hearing it anyway. Most of the women in town agree. We've been watching him court prospects through letters for 2 years now. You're the third woman he's rejected at the station." Sarah's expression turned rueful. "We tried to warn you, but by the time we knew you were coming, you were already on the train." Margaret absorbed this information, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. "Third?" "First was a woman from Ohio, 45, I think. Too old for his taste. Second was from Missouri. Too plain, apparently. And now you." Sarah shook her head. "The man wants a wife who looks like a daughter. It's pathetic." "It's worse than pathetic," Margaret said quietly. "It's cruel." "Yes, it is." Sarah glanced over at Samuel, who was paying for their supplies. "But it seems you landed on your feet anyway. Samuel Reed's a good man. Quiet. Keeps to himself, but solid. You could do worse." "We're not—" Margaret stopped, realizing she didn't actually know how to finish that sentence. What were they? Housemates? Friends? Two people bound together by circumstance and mutual stubbornness? "It's complicated." "It always is." Sarah touched Margaret's arm briefly. "The reason I approached you, aside from wanting to welcome you properly, is to invite you to a gathering we're having Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just some of the women from town getting together at the hotel. Cards, conversation, pie if anyone remembers to bring it. You'd be welcome." Margaret felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Hope, maybe, or the memory of what it felt like to have friends, to be included, to be wanted. "That's kind of you, but I'm not sure—" "Think about it," Sarah said. "The invitation stands, and Miss Ellis, don't let Harold Vaughn's stupidity make you think there's no place for you here. Rollins might not look like much, but it's got room for people who are willing to make their own space." Samuel appeared beside them then, supplies gathered, ready to go. Sarah nodded to him politely, squeezed Margaret's hand once, and moved away to her own shopping. "Making friends?" Samuel asked as they headed back to the wagon. "Maybe," Margaret said. "Strange feeling." They loaded the supplies and were about to climb back up when a man's voice called out from across the street. "Reed, hold up a moment." Samuel's shoulders tensed, but he turned. The man approaching was older, maybe 60, with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest and a face that had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by anything. "Sheriff Blake?" Samuel said evenly. "Reed." The sheriff nodded to Margaret. "Ma'am, sorry to interrupt your day, but I need to ask if you've seen any strangers around your property lately." Samuel's expression didn't change, but Margaret felt the shift in his posture. "Why?" "Had a report from the Henderson place. Someone broke into their barn 2 nights ago. Didn't take much, just some food and a blanket. But Mrs. Henderson said she saw a man watching their house from the tree line the day before. Tall, dark coat, moved like he didn't want to be seen." "We had a visitor during the storm last week," Samuel said carefully. "Man named Elias Ward. Said his horse went lame. We gave him shelter for the night." "And he tried to steal my rifle around midnight. Margaret here convinced him that was a poor decision. The sheriff's eyebrows rose, and he turned his full attention to Margaret for the first time. That so? That so? Margaret confirmed. He left in a hurry. Haven't seen him since. Could you describe him? Margaret did, detailing everything she remembered, the two quick eyes, the smile that didn't reach them, the way he'd watched them through the evening like he was calculating distances and opportunities. The sheriff listened, nodding occasionally, his expression growing grimmer. That matches what Henderson's wife described, he said finally. I've got notices out to the neighboring counties. Man like that, moving through territory, watching properties, that's not someone passing through. That's someone planning something. What do you need from us? Samuel asked. Keep your eyes open. Keep your doors locked. And if you see him again, don't try to be a hero. Come get me. The sheriff's gaze moved between them. I know you can handle yourself, Reed. And ma'am, anyone who can face down a thief in the middle of the night has my respect. But this fellow's dangerous, and I'd rather bring him in alive than write up reports about dead civilians. Understood, Samuel said. The sheriff tipped his hat and moved on, leaving them standing beside the wagon. Margaret realized her hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline bleeding off now that the confrontation was over. You all right? Samuel asked quietly. Yes. No, I don't know. She climbed up into the wagon, grateful for something to do with her hands. I thought he was just an opportunistic thief, someone desperate and stupid. But if he's watching properties, planning, then he's something worse. Samuel climbed up beside her and took the reins. And he knows where we live. They rode back to the cabin in tense silence, both of them scanning the landscape for any sign of movement, any indication they were being watched. The land looked peaceful in the afternoon light, snow-covered and serene, the kind of landscape that appeared in paintings of the frontier. But Margaret had learned that beauty and danger weren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes the prettiest places held the sharpest teeth. When they reached the cabin, Samuel checked the perimeter while Margaret unloaded supplies, both of them moving with the efficiency of people who'd learned to work together without needing constant communication. Inside, Margaret started preparing dinner while Samuel cleaned and loaded both rifles, setting them in easy reach near the doors and windows. I've been thinking, Margaret said as she peeled potatoes, about what the sheriff said, about not trying to be heroes. And I think that's good advice for most people. But we're not most people, are we? Samuel looked up from his work. What do you mean? I mean that you live alone on a ranch miles from town. I'm a woman who traveled across the country alone. We're not the kind of people who wait for someone else to solve our problems. She set down the knife and turned to face him fully. If Elias Ward comes back, when he comes back, we're going to have to handle it ourselves. The sheriff can't be everywhere. I know. So we should plan, really plan, not just keeping watch, but thinking through scenarios. What we do if he approaches during the day. What we do if he tries to burn us out. What we do if he brings friends. Samuel was quiet for a moment, studying her face. You've thought about this before, about how to defend yourself. It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. I told you I'd used that revolver before. I didn't tell you why. She took a breath, feeling the weight of old memories pressing against her ribs. Robert, my husband, owned a factory in Philadelphia. Good business, employed 50 men. But there was a strike when I was 40, violent one. Men who thought burning and breaking would get them what demanding hadn't. What happened? They came to our house one night, thought they'd scare Robert into meeting their demands. But Robert was at the factory, and I was home alone. Margaret picked up the knife again, needing something to do with her hands. They broke down the front door, 3 of them, and I shot the first man who crossed the threshold. Samuel didn't move, didn't react with shock or horror. He just listened. I didn't kill him, Margaret continued. Hit him in the shoulder, but it was enough to make them think twice about whether scaring the owner's wife was worth dying for. They ran. Robert came home to find me sitting on the stairs with the revolver in my lap and a man bleeding on our foyer floor. Did they arrest you? No, Robert's lawyer made sure of that. Self-defense, clear as day. But the factory closed anyway. Robert said it was because of the strike, but I always thought it was because he couldn't look at me the same after that night, couldn't reconcile the woman who embroidered his shirts with the woman who'd shot a man without hesitation. That's foolish, Samuel said quietly. What is? Not being able to see that those are the same woman. That strength and gentleness aren't opposites. He set down the rifle he'd been cleaning and met her eyes. You did what you had to do, protected yourself. You're home. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some old knot of shame and doubt that she'd carried for 18 years. Robert never said it directly, but I know he thought less of me after that. Thought I should have waited for him to come home. Thought a proper woman would have hidden or screamed or done anything except fight back. Then Robert was a fool too. Samuel stood and crossed to where she stood by the counter. He didn't touch her, but his presence was solid and reassuring. Margaret Ellis, you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Not because you shot a man, though that took courage, but because you kept living after everyone tried to make you smaller. After your husband died, after your sister took you in like charity, after Harold Vaughn looked at you and couldn't see what he had. You kept going. That's real strength. Margaret's eyes stung with tears she refused to shed. Why are you being so kind to me? I'm not being kind. I'm being honest. He paused, then added softly, and maybe because I know what it's like to have people look at you and see something less than what you are. What do you mean? Samuel moved back to the window, looking out at the fading light. I wasn't always a rancher. Used to work for a man in Colorado, big ranch, hundreds of head of cattle. I was good at it, worked my way up to foreman by the time I was 30. Had a woman I was planning to marry. Had a future mapped out. What happened? The owner's son decided he wanted my job. Didn't want to earn it, just wanted it because it was there. So he made up stories, told his father I was stealing cattle, selling them on the side. Wasn't true, but his word against mine, no contest. Samuel's voice was flat, emotionless, but Margaret could hear the old pain underneath. They fired me, ran me off the property, spread the word to every ranch within 100 miles that I was a thief. The woman I'd planned to marry decided she couldn't be associated with someone like that. So I lost everything in one day. Oh, Samuel. Came here to start over. Bought this land with money I'd saved, built this cabin with my own hands, and swore I'd never again let someone else's lies define who I was. He turned back to her. So when I see you standing there carrying the weight of every judgment people have put on you, I recognize it, and I figure the least I can do is tell you the truth. You're stronger than any of them deserve. Margaret crossed the room and did something she hadn't planned, something that surprised her even as she did it. She reached out and took Samuel's hand. His palm was rough against hers, calloused from years of work, warm and solid. Thank you, she said simply. He squeezed her hand once, gently, then released it. We should eat, and then we should plan. Like you said, think through scenarios. They ate dinner as the sun set, painting the snow outside in shades of orange and gold. And then, as darkness settled over the ridge, they sat at the table with the lamp burning between them and planned for the worst. Samuel sketched out the property on a piece of paper, the cabin, the barn, the fence lines, the places where someone could approach unseen. Margaret suggested keeping water barrels near the doors in case of fire. Samuel proposed setting up simple alarms, strings with bells attached, placed along the most likely approaches. Margaret wondered about backup exits, places they could flee if the cabin became untenable. They talked through scenarios until Margaret's eyes burned with exhaustion and Samuel's voice grew rough. And when they finally stopped, when they'd planned as much as they could plan, they sat in silence for a moment, both aware that all the preparation in the world might not be enough. Margaret, Samuel said quietly, if something happens, if word comes back with others, if things go wrong, I want you to run. Don't stay and fight if you don't have to. Just get on a horse and ride for town. No. Margaret, no, she repeated firmly. I'm not running. Not from him, not from anyone. I've done enough running, enough hiding, enough making myself small so other people could be safe. If Elias Ward wants trouble, he'll get it from both of us. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was small and brief, but genuine. You're going to get me killed one of these days. Probably, Margaret agreed, but you'll die knowing you treated me like an equal instead of something fragile that needed protecting. Fair trade, he said, and there was warmth in his voice that made Margaret's heart do something complicated in her chest. That night, they took turns at watch again. Margaret had the hours before dawn, the darkest and coldest time when the world felt suspended between night and morning. She sat by the window with the rifle across her lap and watched the darkness beyond the glass. Nothing moved. The wind had picked up again, sending snow skittering across the drifts, creating shapes and shadows that looked like men until you stared at them long enough to realize they were nothing. Margaret's eyes burned with exhaustion, but she kept them open, kept scanning the darkness, kept waiting for the moment when a shadow would resolve into something real. It didn't come. By the time Samuel woke to take over, false dawn was painting the eastern sky gray. Margaret surrendered her post gratefully and fell into bed without even removing her boots. She slept hard and dreamless, exhausted beyond fear, beyond worry, beyond everything except the need for rest. When she woke, it was full morning and something smelled incredible. Margaret emerged from behind her blanket to find Samuel at the stove, cooking something that involved eggs and onions and bacon. He glanced over his shoulder at her. "Figured you earned a real breakfast. What time is it?" "Nearly 9. I let you sleep." "You should have woken me. You need rest too." "Got enough." He plated the food and brought it to the table. "Eat. Then I have something to ask you." They ate in companionable silence, and Margaret tried not to think about how domestic this felt, how comfortable. Like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. Like this makeshift arrangement had somehow transformed into something that felt dangerously close to home. When they finished, Samuel refilled their coffee cups and sat back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" Margaret asked. "There's a dance in town Saturday night, at the hotel." Margaret set down her cup carefully. "A dance?" "Community gathering. Happens once a month, weather permitting. Music, food, general socializing." He paused. "Sarah Mitchell mentioned it when I was paying for supplies yesterday. Said you'd been invited." "She invited me to cards and conversation, not a dance." "Well, I'm inviting you to the dance." Samuel looked uncomfortable, like he'd rehearsed this speech and was determined to get through it despite his discomfort. "As my guest? If you want." Margaret stared at him. "Samuel Reed, are you asking me to accompany you to a social event?" "Appears so." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through his answer. "Because I've been living alone on this ridge for 5 years. Because people in town probably think I'm half feral by now. And because if you're going to stay here, even temporarily, people should see that you're under my protection. That you're not just some woman I took in out of charity or worse. And you think attending a dance together will accomplish that? I think showing up together and acting like we have every right to be there will accomplish that." His gaze was steady. "I won't pretend to be a good dancer, and I won't pretend people won't talk, but they're already talking. Might as well give them something worth watching." Margaret felt something warm spread through her chest, surprise and pleasure and a little bit of fear. "People will make assumptions. Let them. They'll think we're courting. Are we?" The question was gentle, curious, not demanding. Margaret took a breath. "I don't know what we are. I came here expecting one thing and found something entirely different. You've been kind and respectful, and you've treated me like I matter. That's more than most men manage. But I don't know if that's friendship or something else, or just two lonely people finding comfort in proximity." "Fair enough," Samuel said. "But here's what I know. I like having you here. I like the way you argue with me instead of just agreeing. I like that you're not afraid to shoot intruders or challenge my assumptions or tell me when I'm being an idiot. And I think you deserve to go to a dance without worrying about being judged for existing. Samuel, so come with me Saturday. We'll dance badly, eat mediocre food, and show Rollins that Margaret Ellis isn't going anywhere unless she damn well chooses to." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I have a feeling Sarah Mitchell would be disappointed if you didn't show up." Margaret laughed despite herself. "You're using social pressure to convince me?" "Using every tool available." She looked at him across the table. This quiet, stubborn man who'd offered her shelter and somehow given her so much more. And she thought about Sarah Mitchell's invitation, about the possibility of friendship, about the life she might build here if she was brave enough to claim it. "All right," she said. "Yes, I'll go to your dance." Our dance, he corrected. And Margaret? Thank you. For what? For staying, for fighting, for being exactly who you are. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. Ask me again in a week if you still think that's something to thank me for. I will, Samuel promised, and the answer will be the same. They spent the rest of the day working around the property, setting up their early warning system, checking fence lines, preparing for trouble that might never come. But underneath the practical tasks, something had shifted between them. Some barrier had fallen, and Margaret could feel the space between them changing, becoming charged with possibility. Saturday couldn't come soon enough, and whatever happened at that dance, Margaret knew it would matter. Knew it would change things, one way or another. The question was whether she was ready for that change. As darkness fell and they settled into their watch rotation again, Margaret decided that ready or not, she was done waiting for life to happen to her. It was time to make it happen herself. Saturday arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to make breathing feel like swallowing glass. Margaret woke early, nerves humming beneath her skin in a way she hadn't felt in years. She told herself it was just a dance, just a social gathering in a frontier town, nothing to warrant this flutter of anticipation in her chest. But her hands shook slightly as she poured water into the basin to wash, and she caught herself checking her reflection in the small mirror Samuel kept by the window more times than was strictly necessary. Samuel had ridden out before dawn to check the fence line one more time, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the dress she'd unpacked from her trunk the night before. It was dark blue wool, practical but well made, with jet buttons down the front and lace at the collar that she'd tatted herself during the long Philadelphia winters. Not fancy by city standards, but the best she had. The best she'd owned in years, if she was being honest. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the familiar creak of wheels and jingle of harness that meant Samuel was back. Margaret had coffee ready and bread toasted, but when he came through the door, she noticed he was carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's that?" she asked. Samuel set it on the table, looking almost embarrassed. "Stopped by the general store yesterday. Fletcher's wife does dressmaking on the side. I mentioned you might need something for the dance, and she said she had a dress that a customer never picked up. Asked if I wanted to see it." Margaret stared at the package. "You bought me a dress?" "Didn't buy it. Traded for it." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Had some pelts I'd been meaning to sell. Seemed like a fair exchange." "Samuel, you didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to, but I wanted to." He pushed the package toward her. "Mrs. Fletcher said the woman who ordered it was about your size. If it doesn't fit or you don't like it, no harm done. Wear what you were planning to wear, but I thought—" He trailed off, searching for words. "I thought you deserved something that wasn't about practicality or making do. Something just for you." Margaret's throat tightened. She picked up the package, feeling the weight of fabric beneath the paper, and carefully unwrapped it. The dress that emerged made her breath catch. It was beautiful. Deep burgundy silk with black lace overlay, the kind of dress that would have cost a month's wages in Philadelphia. The neckline was modest but elegant, the sleeves fitted, the skirt full enough to move gracefully. Someone had put real craft into this dress, real care. And now it was hers. "Samuel," she whispered, "this is too much." "It's exactly right," he said firmly. "You're going to walk into that dance hall, and everyone who sees you is going to know that Margaret Ellis is a woman of substance. Not someone's cast-off, not charity, not temporary. Someone who matters." She looked up at him. This man who barely knew her, who owed her nothing, who'd somehow seen past every wall she'd built and understood what she needed before she'd known herself. "I don't know how to thank you." "Wear it," he said simply. "That's thanks enough." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret heated water and bathed behind her blanket, washing away the dust and work of the past weeks. She took down her hair and brushed it until it gleamed, then pinned it up in a style she remembered from her younger days, softer than the severe bun she usually wore. The burgundy dress fit perfectly, settling over her shoulders like it had been made for her body specifically. She studied herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked alive, present, like someone who took up space in the world without apologizing for it. When she emerged from behind the blanket, Samuel was standing by the stove in clean clothes, dark trousers, a pressed shirt, a vest she'd never seen him wear before. He'd shaved and combed his hair, transforming from rough rancher into something that approached refined. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that made Margaret's heart skip. He stared at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "Margaret Ellis, you are a remarkable woman." "It's just a dress. It's not the dress." He crossed to her, moving slowly like he was approaching something precious that might startle. "Though the dress is beautiful, it's you. The way you carry yourself. The way you look at the world like you're daring it to tell you no." He paused, then added with a small smile, "And the way you're terrifying and magnificent all at once." Margaret laughed, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Terrifying?" "In the best possible way." He offered his arm. "Ready to scandalize Rollins?" "I was born ready," she said, and took his arm. They rode into town as afternoon stretched toward evening, the sky turning gold and pink at the edges. The hotel hall was already filling with people when they arrived, music drifting out into the cold air, along with warmth and laughter. Samuel helped Margaret down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood together in the street, listening to the fiddle and piano inside. "Last chance to change your mind," Samuel said. "We could go back to the cabin. No one would blame you." "I would blame me." Margaret straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "Besides, we came to give them something to talk about. Might as well deliver." They walked through the door together, and the room fell silent. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden hush, no gasps of shock, but conversation dimmed, heads turned, and Margaret felt the weight of every eye in that hall settle on her. She saw Sarah Mitchell near the refreshment table, smiling with open encouragement. She saw the sheriff and his wife, nodding with what looked like approval. She saw Harold Vaughn standing near the far wall, his face going pale and then red as he registered who'd just walked in. And she saw a dozen other faces, curious, judgmental, welcoming, hostile, all of them forming opinions, making assessments, deciding whether Margaret Ellis deserved a place in their community. Let them look, let them judge. She was done living small. Samuel led her further into the room, his hand steady at her elbow, his presence solid beside her. They'd barely made it 5 steps when Sarah Mitchell appeared at Margaret's side like a guardian angel. "Miss Ellis, I'm so glad you came." Sarah took Margaret's hands in hers, squeezing warmly. "And that dress, you look absolutely stunning." "Mrs. Fletcher's handiwork," Margaret said. "Samuel was kind enough to arrange it." "Was he now?" Sarah glanced at Samuel with knowing eyes. "How thoughtful of you, Mr. Reed." Samuel nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Seemed appropriate. Very appropriate. Sarah looped her arm through Margaret's, gently separating her from Samuel. "I hope you don't mind, but I'm stealing your guest for a moment. There are some ladies I'd like her to meet." Samuel looked at Margaret, silently asking permission. She nodded once, and he released her with visible reluctance. "I'll get us some punch," he said, and retreated toward the refreshment table like a man escaping enemy territory. Sarah guided Margaret toward a cluster of women gathered near the piano. They ranged in age from early 20s to perhaps 70, all dressed in their finest, all watching Margaret's approach with varying degrees of interest. "Ladies," Sarah said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Ellis. She's recently arrived from Philadelphia and is staying with Samuel Reed. Margaret, this is Rebecca Chen. She runs the laundry. Martha Gunderson, whose husband owns the livery. Louise Parker, our school teacher. And Dorothy Whitman, who's been in Rollins longer than anyone can remember." Margaret nodded to each woman, reading their faces, gauging their reactions. Rebecca Chen's expression was friendly and open. Martha Gunderson looked reserved, but not hostile. Louise Parker seemed curious, her school teacher's eyes sharp and assessing. Dorothy Whitman, ancient and sharp-featured, studied Margaret like she was a puzzle to be solved. "Philadelphia," Dorothy said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Long way from home." "Yes, ma'am," Margaret agreed, "though I'm finding that home might be more about where you choose to be than where you started." Diplomatic answer. Dorothy's eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. "But you didn't come here for philosophy. You came here because Harold Vaughn's an idiot and Samuel Reed has better sense than most men manage. Am I close?" The bluntness startled a laugh out of Margaret. "Close enough." "Good. I appreciate honesty." Dorothy gestured with her cane toward where Harold stood across the room, looking distinctly uncomfortable. That fool's rejected 3 good women because he's looking for something that doesn't exist, eternal youth in someone else's face. You're better off with Reed. At least he knows what he wants. And what's that? Margaret asked, genuinely curious. Someone real. Dorothy's gaze was knowing. Someone who won't bore him or break under pressure. Someone worth the trouble. She paused, then added, "Question is, do you know what you want?" Margaret met the old woman's eyes. "I want to stop apologizing for existing. I want to build something that's mine. And I want to be seen for who I am, not who people think I should be." "Then you're in the right place," Dorothy said. "Rollins doesn't care much about what you should be. We care about what you do and whether you pull your weight." She tapped her cane once for emphasis. "Welcome to town, Margaret Ellis. Try not to let the gossips drive you away." "I survived Philadelphia society," Margaret said dryly. "I think I can handle Rollins." The women laughed at that, and the tension that had been hovering over the conversation broke. Rebecca launched into a story about a customer who'd brought in laundry that included a live chicken somehow. Martha shared gossip about the new family moving in near the river. Louise asked Margaret about Philadelphia, genuine curiosity in her questions. And slowly, carefully, Margaret felt herself relaxing into the conversation, into this circle of women who were choosing to include her rather than exclude her. Samuel returned with punch and found Margaret surrounded by women, all of them talking and laughing like they'd known each other for years instead of minutes. He caught Margaret's eye over the crowd, and she smiled at him, a real smile that said, "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for making me face this. Thank you for believing I could do it." He smiled back, small and private, then retreated to where a group of men stood discussing cattle prices and weather predictions. The music started up again, a lively reel that had couples moving onto the makeshift dance floor. Margaret watched them, feeling the familiar rhythm in her bones, remembering Philadelphia ballrooms and Robert's hand at her waist, remembering when dancing had been as natural as breathing. "You should dance," Sarah said beside her. "I'm not sure—" "Samuel's watching you like you're the only person in this room," Sarah continued quietly, "and you're watching him like you're trying to figure out whether to run toward him or away. Might as well settle it on the dance floor." Margaret glanced across the room and found Samuel watching her, just as Sarah had said. Their eyes met and he raised an eyebrow, question and challenge and invitation all at once. She nodded. He crossed the room with purpose, weaving between couples and clusters of conversation until he stood before her. He offered his hand, no words necessary. Margaret placed her hand in his and let him lead her onto the floor. They joined the other couples as the fiddle sang and the piano thundered, and for a moment Margaret felt awkward, uncertain, too aware of the people watching, too conscious of how long it had been since she'd done this. But then Samuel's hand settled at her waist, firm and steady, and his other hand clasped hers, and he said quietly, "Just follow me. I've got you." So she did. They moved together, not gracefully. Samuel had been honest about his dancing skills, but with a synchronicity that surprised her. He was steady where she faltered, patient when she stumbled, his presence grounding her when she felt like she might float away from sheer nervousness. And gradually, as the music swelled and the room spun around them, Margaret stopped thinking about the steps and started feeling the dance. It was like flying, like being young again, like remembering that her body was capable of joy, not just endurance. Samuel pulled her closer as the tempo changed, and Margaret found herself pressed against him, his warmth seeping through the layers of silk and propriety. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, could smell soap and leather and something indefinably him, could see the concentration in his eyes as he navigated them through the crowd of dancers. "You're better at this than you claimed," she said breathlessly. "I'm motivated," he replied. "Don't want to step on that dress." "The dress isn't what you should worry about stepping on." "I know." His voice dropped lower. "You're the most beautiful woman in this room, Margaret Ellis, and everyone here knows it." She stumbled slightly, caught off guard by the directness of the compliment. "Samuel, I'm not saying it to flatter you. I'm saying it because it's true." His hand tightened at her waist. "And because you should know that when people look at us dancing, they're not seeing a rancher in his charity case. They're seeing 2 people who fit." "Do we fit?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "I think we might," he said, "if we're brave enough to try." The music swelled toward its crescendo, and Samuel spun her out and back, and Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, some old fear or doubt or limiting belief about what she deserved. She'd come to Rollins expecting to be someone's wife, someone's solution, someone's second choice. But standing here in Samuel Reed's arms, moving to music in a room full of strangers who were becoming less strange by the moment, she realized she'd found something better. She'd found herself. The song ended with a flourish, and the room erupted in applause, though whether for the musicians or the dancers, Margaret couldn't tell. Samuel released her waist, but kept hold of her hand, leading her off the floor toward the relative quiet near the windows. "Punch?" he asked. "Please. And air. Definitely air." He left her by the window while he fetched drinks, and Margaret pressed her overheated face against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the surface. Her heart was still racing, her mind still spinning from the dance, from Samuel's words, from the impossible reality of this moment. "Well, well. Looks like you've made quite the impression." Margaret turned to find Harold Vaughn standing beside her, punch cup in hand, expression carefully neutral. She'd known this confrontation was coming, had felt it hovering at the edges of the evening like a storm waiting to break. "Mr. Vaughn," she said coolly, "I didn't realize you were still in Rollins." "I live here," he said, and there was a touch of defensiveness in his voice. "Have for 3 years." "How permanent of you." His jaw tightened. "I wanted to apologize for how I behaved at the station. It was ungentlemanly." "Yes, it was." Margaret saw no reason to soften the truth. "You invited me across the country on a promise, then rejected me based on appearance. That's not just ungentlemanly, Mr. Vaughn. It's cruel." "I didn't mean—" "I'm not interested in what you meant. I'm interested in what you did." She turned to face him fully, and she saw him flinch slightly under her gaze. "You wasted my time, my money, and my hope. But more than that, you made me question my worth. Made me wonder if I was foolish to think I deserve better than loneliness. That's the real damage. Miss Ellis, I'm trying to apologize." "Then apologize by doing better next time," Margaret said. "Stop courting women through letters and rejecting them in person. Stop looking for eternal youth in someone else's face. Stop wasting everyone's time, including your own." She softened slightly, seeing genuine discomfort in his expression. "You're not a bad man, Harold, just a deluded one. Figure out what you actually want before you invite another woman to upend her life for you." Harold opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Samuel Reed is a good man, better than me, clearly." "Yes, he is." Margaret didn't bother denying it. "And I'm fortunate to have found that out, even if the path here was painful." "For what it's worth," Harold said quietly, "I am sorry. You deserve better than what I gave you." "Yes, I did." Margaret nodded once. "But I found it anyway. So perhaps things worked out as they should." Harold studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Margaret watched him go and felt nothing but relief. He'd been an ending, not a beginning. A door closing so another could open. Samuel appeared beside her, 2 cups of punch in hand. "Saw you talking to Vaughn. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine." Margaret took the punch gratefully, drinking deep. He apologized. I accepted. We're both moving on with our lives. Good. Samuel didn't press for details, and Margaret loved him a little bit for that restraint. "Ready for another dance?" "Actually," Margaret said slowly, "I was thinking about getting some air. Real air, not window air. Would you walk with me?" "Of course." They retrieved their coats and slipped out into the cold night. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and Margaret's breath came in visible puffs as they walked slowly down the street, away from the music and light of the hall. The town was quiet around them, most of its residents either at the dance or home for the evening. Stars blazed overhead, cold and brilliant in the way they only got on frontier nights, when there were no city lights to dim them. "Thank you," Margaret said after they'd walked a block in companionable silence. "For what?" "For tonight. For the dress. For making me come when I wanted to hide. For dancing with me even though you claimed to be terrible at it." She paused, gathering courage. for seeing me when everyone else was looking through me. Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her. In the starlight, his face was all shadows and angles, but his eyes were warm. Margaret, I need to tell you something. Her heart skipped. All right. When I brought you back to the cabin that first day, I told myself it was just help, just offering shelter to someone who needed it. But that wasn't entirely true. He took a breath. The truth is, I saw you standing on that platform, and I saw someone strong enough to cross the country on a promise, someone brave enough to face rejection with dignity, someone who didn't crumble when life didn't go as planned. And I thought, that's someone worth knowing. Samuel, let me finish. He stepped closer. These past weeks, having you at the cabin, working beside you, watching you handle every challenge with grace and grit, it's been the best weeks I've had in 5 years. Maybe longer. You make me want to be better, want to do more than just survive. And I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other, but I need you to know that when I look at you, I don't see age or convenience or temporary. I see a partner, someone I could build a life with, if you were willing. Margaret stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Are you asking me to stay? I'm asking if you want to stay, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you want to be. His voice was rough with emotion. I'm asking if maybe, possibly, you might consider making this permanent, making us permanent. Samuel Reed, Margaret said slowly. Are you proposing to me? Not yet. A smile ghosted across his face. Figured I should court you properly first. Take you on buggy rides. Bring you flowers if I can find any that haven't frozen. Write you letters that actually tell the truth instead of pretty lies. He reached out and took her hand. But yes, eventually, if you'll have me. I want to marry you, Margaret Ellis. Want to wake up next to you for whatever years we've got left. Want to build something real with you. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I came here looking for a partnership. Harold promised me that and failed to deliver. But you've been giving me exactly that without even being asked. She squeezed his hand. Yes, I want to stay. Yes, I want to build something real. And yes, when you do eventually propose, I'll probably say yes to that too. The relief that washed over Samuel's face was beautiful to see. He pulled her closer, and for a moment they just stood there in the frozen street, holding each other, breathing the same air. We should probably tell people, Samuel said against her hair, before they gossip us into being married without actually having the ceremony. Margaret laughed, the sound muffled against his chest. Let them gossip. I'm done caring what people think. That's my girl. He pulled back just enough to see her face. Though speaking of ceremonies, if we do this, I want to do it properly. Church, witnesses, a real wedding, not sneaking around or pretending it's something less than it is. Agreed. Margaret looked up at him, and in the starlight his face was open and honest and real. But Samuel, we should probably actually spend some time courting before we start planning the wedding, just to make sure we don't drive each other crazy. Oh, we'll definitely drive each other crazy, he said with absolute certainty. Question is whether it's the good kind of crazy or the bad kind. Well then, Margaret said, I suppose we'll find out. They walked back to the hall hand in hand, and when they entered, the conversation around them shifted, people noting their linked hands, their matching expressions, the way they moved together like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. Sarah Mitchell caught Margaret's eye across the room and grinned, giving her a discreet thumbs up. Dorothy Whitman nodded with satisfaction, like she'd predicted this outcome all along. The music started up again, and Samuel led Margaret back onto the floor. This time, she didn't stumble. This time, she knew the steps. This time, when he pulled her close and they moved together to the rhythm of fiddle and piano, it felt less like dancing and more like flying. The evening wore on, filled with music and conversation and moments that felt suspended in amber, perfect and preserved. Margaret danced with Samuel until her feet ached. She talked with the women of Rollins until her voice grew hoarse. She ate pie that Rebecca Chen had brought, drank punch that Sarah had spiked with something stronger than juice, and laughed more in those few hours than she had in the past 3 years combined. And through it all, she felt Samuel's presence beside her, steady, solid, real. Not a fantasy built from letters and longing, but a man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. A man who offered partnership instead of pretty words, honesty instead of flattery, reality instead of romance. Though if Margaret was being honest with herself, this felt pretty romantic too. They left the dance as midnight approached, exhausted and happy, and buzzing with the kind of contentment that came from an evening well spent. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, but it was the comfortable quiet of people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. When they reached the cabin, Samuel helped Margaret down from the wagon with exaggerated gallantry that made her laugh. Inside, the stove had gone cold, and he set about building up the fire while Margaret changed behind her blanket, trading the beautiful burgundy dress for her nightgown and robe. They sat by the fire until it roared to life, warming the cabin, pushing back the cold that pressed against the walls. Samuel made tea, and they drank it slowly, neither quite ready to end the evening and retreat to their separate corners. "Margaret," Samuel said eventually, "I meant what I said earlier, about courting you properly, about building something real. I know you did. But I also want to be clear about something." He set down his teacup and looked at her directly. "I'm not Harold Vaughn. I'm not going to make you promises I can't keep or paint pictures of a life that doesn't exist. This ranch is hard work. Winters are brutal. We're isolated out here, and loneliness is as much a threat as any storm or threat. If you stay, if you choose this life, you need to know what you're choosing." "I appreciate the honesty," Margaret said. "But Samuel, I already know what I'm choosing. I've been living it for weeks now. Working beside you, defending this place, building something from nothing. I know it's hard. I know it's lonely sometimes. But I also know it's real, and it's mine. And that matters more than comfort or convenience." "You're sure?" "I'm 58 years old," Margaret said firmly. "I've had a lifetime to figure out what I want. And I want this. I want you. I want to build something that matters, even if it's small and isolated and hard-won." She paused, then added, "Besides, I'm fairly certain I can handle whatever you throw at me. I've survived worse than a Wyoming winter." Samuel smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Yes, you have, and you'll survive this too. We both will." They finished their tea in companionable silence, and when Margaret finally stood to go to bed, Samuel stood too. For a moment they faced each other across the small space of the cabin, and Margaret felt the weight of possibility hanging between them. All the tomorrows they might have, all the challenges they'd face, all the moments of joy and difficulty that lay ahead. "Good night, Margaret," Samuel said softly. "Good night, Samuel." She retreated behind her blanket and climbed into bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. Through the fabric, she could hear Samuel banking the fire, preparing the cabin for night, moving through his familiar routines. It was comforting, that sound, reassuring, the sound of someone who'd be there tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days beyond that. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself imagine it, the life they'd build together, the partnership they'd create, the home they'd make in this isolated place. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But it would be theirs, built on honesty and respect, and the kind of love that grew slowly, steadily, putting down roots that went deep. She'd come to Rollins looking for a fresh start, and she'd found so much more than that. She'd found a purpose, a place, a partner who saw her not as a problem to be solved or a convenience to be used, but as a woman of substance and strength. She'd found herself. And in the darkness of the cabin, with Samuel Reed breathing softly on the other side of the blanket and stars blazing overhead, Margaret Ellis finally understood what home felt like. Not a place on a map or a building with walls, but a feeling. The feeling of being seen, being valued, being exactly where she was meant to be. Tomorrow, they'd wake up and face whatever challenges the day brought. They'd work the ranch, watch for trouble, continue building the life they'd started. But tonight, for this moment, everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. And Margaret fell asleep smiling, dreaming of the future she was choosing, one day at a time. The week following the dance unfolded with a quiet intensity that Margaret had never experienced before. Each morning brought new routines, new understandings, new moments of connection that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Samuel courted her the way he did everything else, with quiet determination and absolute sincerity. He brought her wildflowers he'd somehow found growing in a sheltered spot near the creek, their petals fragile against the snow. He read to her in the evenings from books he'd collected over the years, his voice rough but steady. He asked her opinions on everything from where to expand the fence line to what they should plant in the spring garden, treating her thoughts as valuable rather than decorative. And Margaret found herself falling, not the breathless, reckless falling of youth, but something deeper and more deliberate. The kind of love that grew from respect and partnership, from shared work and honest conversation, from seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway. But the shadow of Elias Ward still hung over them like a storm that wouldn't quite break. It came to a head on Thursday morning, 5 days after the dance. Margaret was in the barn gathering eggs when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. She set down the basket and reached for the rifle Samuel had started insisting she carry everywhere, her heart already accelerating with the certainty that whatever was coming wasn't friendly. Samuel appeared in the barn doorway, his own rifle in hand, his face grim. 3 riders, coming up the north path. Ward? Can't tell yet, but they're not moving like friends. He positioned himself where he could see the approach while staying mostly hidden. Margaret, I need you to get to the house. Bar the door from inside. If things go bad, we've already had this conversation, Margaret interrupted, moving to stand beside him. I'm not hiding while you face whatever this is alone. Damn it, woman. Save your breath, Samuel Reed. You're not getting rid of me that easily. Despite the tension, despite the danger riding toward them, Samuel's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile. Stubborn. Practical, Margaret corrected. 2 guns are better than 1, and you know it. The riders crested the rise, and Margaret's stomach dropped. Elias Ward sat on the lead horse, and he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, rough-looking characters with hard faces and harder eyes, the kind of men who made their living on the wrong side of the law. They stopped 20 feet from the barn, close enough to talk but far enough that they couldn't be easily reached. Ward smiled, and it was the same smile Margaret remembered from the night of the storm, all teeth and no warmth. Reed, Ward called out, been meaning to come back and collect what's mine. Nothing here belongs to you, Samuel said, his voice carrying clear and cold across the distance. Well now, that's where you're wrong. Ward's eyes slid to Margaret, and his smile widened. I left something behind that night, something valuable. Figured it was time to retrieve it. Margaret felt ice slide down her spine. He wasn't talking about property. He was talking about revenge. You've got 3 seconds to turn those horses around and ride out, Samuel said. After that, we start shooting. That's not very hospitable, Ward said, especially considering you're outnumbered. Numbers don't mean much when you're the first one to take a bullet, Margaret called out, raising her rifle to her shoulder. And I promise you, Mr. Ward, I won't miss twice. Ward's smile faltered slightly. The lady's got spirit. I'll give her that. The lady's got aim, Margaret corrected, and very little patience for men who threaten her home. One of Ward's companions shifted nervously in his saddle. Elias, you didn't say nothing about facing down 2 armed people. Said this was just a simple robbery. Shut up, Jensen, Ward snapped. No, let him talk, Samuel said. Seems like your friends might be smarter than you are, Ward. Smart enough to know when a job's not worth the risk. The third man spoke up, his voice rough. What's really going on here, Elias? You said we were hitting an empty ranch, taking supplies. You got some kind of personal grudge? It's complicated, Ward said tightly. Then uncomplicate it, the man said, because I'm not getting shot over your hurt pride. Margaret watched the dynamic shift, saw the moment Ward's plan started crumbling. He'd recruited these men under false pretenses, and now they were seeing the truth. This wasn't a simple robbery, it was a vendetta. And vendettas got people killed. Here's what's going to happen, Samuel said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even dangerous men listen. You're going to turn around and ride back to wherever you came from. Ward, you're going to leave this territory and never come back. And if you ever threaten Margaret or this ranch again, I'll hunt you down myself. Is that clear? You can't, I can, and I will. Samuel's finger moved to the trigger. I'm a patient man, Ward, but my patience has limits, and you crossed them the moment you brought armed men to my property. So here's your choice. Ride away now, or we settle this right here. Your call. The tension stretched so tight Margaret could barely breathe. She kept her rifle trained on Ward, watching his face, reading the calculations running behind his eyes. He was trying to figure out if his pride was worth dying for, whether revenge mattered more than survival. The man called Jensen made the decision for him. "I'm out." He turned his horse. "This is your mess, Elias. Not mine." The third man hesitated, then followed. "Good luck, Ward. You're going to need it." They rode away, leaving Ward alone facing 2 rifles and a future that had suddenly become much more complicated than he'd planned. For a moment, Margaret thought he might actually be stupid enough to try something anyway. Thought his pride might override his survival instinct. But then Sheriff Blake's voice rang out from behind Ward. "That's far enough, Ward. You're under arrest." Ward spun in his saddle to find the sheriff and 2 deputies emerging from the trees where they'd apparently been watching the entire confrontation. His face went white, then red with fury. "This is a setup," he spat. "This is justice," the sheriff corrected. He dismounted and approached Ward with his pistol drawn. "Get down from that horse, nice and slow. You're wanted for robbery, theft, and now attempted assault. We've been tracking you for weeks, and you just gave me all the evidence I need." Ward looked from the sheriff to Samuel to Margaret, and Margaret saw the moment he realized he'd lost. His shoulders slumped, and he dismounted without further protest. The sheriff's deputies moved in to secure him, and Blake walked over to where Samuel and Margaret stood. "Sorry for using you as bait," he said, "but we needed to catch him in the act. Couldn't arrest him on suspicion alone." "You knew he was coming?" Samuel asked. "Got word yesterday from a saloon keeper in town. Ward's been drinking and talking, making threats against you and Miss Ellis. Figured it was only a matter of time before he made his move." Blake glanced at Margaret. "Your description from that first night helped. We've been building a case, connecting him to robberies across 3 counties. This just sealed it." Margaret lowered her rifle, surprised to find her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "What happens to him?" "Trial, then prison. He'll be away for a long time." Blake tipped his hat to her. "You handled yourself well, ma'am. Not many women would stand their ground like that." "Not many women had a reason to," Margaret said quietly, looking at Samuel. The sheriff smiled knowingly. "I suspect you found several reasons to stay in Rollins, Miss Ellis. Speaking of which," he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This came for you at the post office. Fletcher was going to hold it until you came to town, but since I was riding out here anyway." Margaret took the envelope with confusion. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the postmark from Philadelphia. She opened it carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was from her sister. "Dear Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well, and that Wyoming has proven to be everything you hoped. I write with both apology and news. First, the apology. I should have been more supportive of your decision to leave. You were right when you said you needed more than kindness. You needed a life of your own. I see that now, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. The news is that I've sold the house in Philadelphia. Thomas got a position in Boston, and we're moving in the spring. I wanted you to know that your belongings, the things you left behind, have been packed and will be shipped to you once you send an address. I also wanted you to know that you were right about something else. You were never a burden. You were family, and I should have made you feel like family instead of a guest in my home. I hope Wyoming treats you kindly. I hope you find what you were looking for. Your sister, Elizabeth." Margaret read the letter twice, feeling emotions she couldn't quite name wash over her. Relief, maybe. Vindication. But also sadness for the years they'd wasted dancing around truth instead of speaking it plainly. "Everything all right?" Samuel asked quietly. "Yeah," Margaret said, folding the letter carefully. "Everything's ending and beginning exactly as it should." The sheriff and his deputies left with Ward in custody, and suddenly the ranch was quiet again. Samuel and Margaret stood in the space between the barn and the house, the crisis past, the danger gone, facing each other in the aftermath. "That was terrifying," Margaret said. "Yes, it was. And exhilarating. That too. And I never want to do it again." Samuel laughed, the sound breaking the tension that still hummed between them. "Agreed." He looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression. "Margaret Ellis, I had a whole plan for this. Was going to wait until spring, bring you flowers that weren't half frozen, Maybe take you on a proper picnic by the creek. Margaret's heart started beating faster. Samuel, but I just watched you face down 3 armed men without flinching. Watched you stand your ground and defend this place like it was already yours. And I realized I'm tired of waiting for the perfect moment when we've already been living the perfect reality. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple gold, worn smooth with age. This was my mother's, only thing of value she left me when she passed. I've been carrying it around for 3 days, waiting for the right time to ask. Ask what? Margaret whispered, though she already knew. Margaret Ellis, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need a home or I need a housekeeper, but because we fit. Because you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. Because I want to spend whatever years I have left waking up next to you and falling asleep knowing you're there. Because I love you. The last 3 words hung in the air between them, simple and profound and absolutely true. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks, warm against her cold skin. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because Harold Vaughn was an idiot or because I needed rescuing, but because you see me, really see me, because you make me want to be brave instead of safe, because I love you too. Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along, and then he was kissing her, his hands cupping her face, his lips warm and sure against hers. It wasn't the first kiss of youth or the desperate kiss of loneliness. It was the kiss of 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and chosen to build something real together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, both smiling like fools, Samuel said, "We should probably tell people. Make it official." "We should probably eat breakfast first," Margaret said practically. "I'm starving, and I'd rather not faint during my own wedding planning." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Margaret noticed the way the morning light caught the gold of the ring on her finger. Her mother's wedding ring had been ornate, covered in small diamonds, impressive but cold. This ring was simple and warm and real, just like the man who'd given it to her, just like the life they'd build together. Over breakfast, they talked logistics. They decided on a winter wedding, no point in waiting for spring when they already knew what they wanted. They'd ask Reverend Morrison to perform the ceremony, invite the whole town if they wanted to come, and have the reception at the hotel where Sarah Mitchell could fuss over details the way she clearly wanted to. "Your sister's letter," Samuel said as they cleared the dishes. "You going to write back?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I'll tell her I'm getting married. Tell her I found what I was looking for and it wasn't what I expected, but it's better than I dreamed." She paused, considering. "And I'll thank her for letting me go, for pushing me out of the nest even when it didn't feel kind. Sometimes the hardest loves are the truest ones." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret and Samuel rode to town to speak with Reverend Morrison, who agreed to perform the ceremony with barely concealed delight. Sarah Mitchell commandeered the wedding planning with enthusiastic efficiency, recruiting half the women in town to help with food, decorations, and general organization. Dorothy Whitman appointed herself Margaret's advisor, offering unsolicited but surprisingly useful advice about everything from what to wear to how to handle married life. "The secret," Dorothy told Margaret one afternoon while they were hemming the ivory dress Sarah had miraculously produced from somewhere, "is to never stop being yourself. Men marry you for who you are, then spend the next 20 years trying to change you. Don't let them. And don't try to change them either. Just be yourselves together." "That's what we've been doing," Margaret said. "Then keep doing it." Dorothy tied off a thread with practiced precision. "And Margaret, I'm glad you stayed. Rollins needs more women like you, women with spine and sense and the courage to claim what they want." The wedding was set for the first Saturday in December. Margaret woke that morning to find snow falling gently outside the window, covering the world in fresh white. It felt like a blessing, like the land itself was celebrating. Samuel had spent the night at Sarah Mitchell's hotel. Apparently it was bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, and Sarah had been adamant about maintaining at least some traditions. Margaret missed his presence in the cabin, missed the steady sound of his breathing, missed the comfort of knowing he was there, but she also appreciated the space to prepare herself mentally for what was about to happen. She was getting married. At 58 years old, after spending years convinced her life was essentially over, she was starting completely fresh. It was terrifying and wonderful and absolutely right. Sarah arrived mid-morning with an entourage of women, Rebecca Chen, Martha Gunderson, Louise Parker, all of them chattering and laughing as they helped Margaret prepare. They styled her hair, adjusted her dress, added touches of lace and ribbon that transformed her from practical ranch woman to bride. When Margaret finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked radiant, alive, happy in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or dress, and everything to do with the light shining from within. "You're going to knock Samuel Reed right off his feet," Sarah said with satisfaction. "I hope not," Margaret replied. "I'd rather he stay upright for the ceremony." The women laughed, and then Sarah was ushering everyone toward the door. "Time to go. Can't keep your groom waiting." The church was packed when they arrived. It seemed like the entire town had turned out. Ranchers and shopkeepers, families and single men, people Margaret had met, and people she'd only seen from a distance. They filled the pews, their faces curious and welcoming and genuinely happy for her. Margaret stood at the back of the church, her hand on Sarah's arm, looking down the aisle toward where Samuel stood waiting. He wore a dark suit that looked new, his hair combed back, his face clean-shaven. But it was his expression that made Margaret's breath catch, pure, undiluted joy mixed with something that looked like awe. The piano started playing, and Sarah squeezed Margaret's arm once before releasing her. "Go get your man." Margaret walked down the aisle alone. She'd thought about asking someone to give her away. Sheriff Blake had offered, kind man that he was. But in the end, she decided she'd give herself. She'd come this far on her own strength, made her own choices, claimed her own future. This final walk was hers to take. Samuel watched her approach, and Margaret saw his eyes glisten with unshed tears. When she reached him, he took both her hands in his and said quietly, so only she could hear, "You are so beautiful." "So are you," she whispered back. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat and began the ceremony. The words washed over Margaret in a blur of traditional phrases and sacred promises. She heard herself making vows, heard Samuel's voice rough with emotion as he made his. She felt him slide a second ring onto her finger, a wedding band to go with his mother's ring, and she slid one onto his finger in return. And then the Reverend was saying, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Reed, you may kiss your bride." Samuel cupped Margaret's face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her gently, reverently, like she was something precious he couldn't quite believe he got to keep. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and Margaret heard Dorothy Whitman's voice rising above the rest. "About damn time." They walked back down the aisle together, married, partners, facing the future as a team. Outside the church, people threw rice and offered congratulations, and Margaret felt overwhelmed by the genuine warmth from people who'd been strangers just weeks ago. The reception at the hotel was loud and joyous, and everything a celebration should be. There was food and music and dancing, and Margaret found herself passed from partner to partner as half the town wanted to dance with the bride. Samuel watched with amusement, clearly content to let her enjoy the attention while he stood with the other men and accepted their handshakes and backslaps. But finally, as the afternoon stretched toward evening, he claimed her for a slow dance. They moved together in the center of the floor, and Margaret rested her head against his shoulder, exhausted and happy and complete. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Reed?" Samuel asked. Margaret smiled at the name. Mrs. Reed. Not Miss Ellis anymore. Not the widow Ellis. Not her sister's charity case. Mrs. Reed, partner to Samuel, wife, woman in her own right. "I feel perfect," she said honestly. "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Good." He held her closer. "Because I'm not letting you go. I'm not planning on leaving." They danced until the music stopped, and then they stood together in the middle of the floor, surrounded by people who'd become family, holding each other like they were the only two people in the world. Eventually, Sarah appeared with their coats. "Time for you two to go home. We'll clean up here. You've got better things to do than help with dishes on your wedding night." Samuel and Margaret made their goodbyes, accepting final congratulations and well wishes, and then they were in the wagon heading back to the ranch. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear, stars blazing overhead in impossible numbers. The cold bit at Margaret's face, but Samuel had wrapped her in blankets, and his presence beside her was warm. When they reached the cabin, Samuel lifted Margaret down from the wagon with exaggerated care. "Carrying you over the threshold is traditional, I believe. Samuel Reed, if you throw out your back trying to carry me, I will never let you live it down. Have some faith in your husband, woman." He swept her into his arms with surprising ease and carried her through the door, kicking it closed behind them. The cabin was warm. Someone, probably Sarah, had come earlier to build up the fire and leave lamps burning. It looked cozy and welcoming and like home. Samuel set Margaret down gently, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other, married couple, in their own home, future spreading out before them. "I love you, Margaret Reed," Samuel said. "I love you too," Margaret replied. "And I'm going to keep loving you through every winter storm and summer drought and difficult day we face. Through all of it." "Through all of it," he agreed. They moved through the evening together, talking and laughing and simply being with each other. And when they finally went to bed, together now, no blanket dividing the space, no separation between them, Margaret felt peace settle over her like the snow had settled over the land outside. She'd come to Rollins looking for a fresh start, and she'd found so much more. She'd found strength she didn't know she had. She'd found a home that was hers to build. She'd found a partner who saw her clearly and loved her anyway. She'd found herself. The next morning, Margaret woke wrapped in Samuel's arms, sunlight streaming through the window, the world outside covered in perfect white. She lay there for a moment, listening to his breathing, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, marveling at the simple miracle of being exactly where she was meant to be. Samuel stirred and tightened his arms around her. "Morning, wife. Morning, husband. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years." Margaret shifted to look at him properly. "Samuel, I want to write to Elizabeth today. Tell her about the wedding. Thank her properly for letting me go." "That's good." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And I want to start building that addition we talked about. Extra bedroom for when we have visitors. Maybe a proper office for you." "An office? You're going to need somewhere to work. Figured you might want to write or keep books or whatever you decide to do with your time that isn't just ranch work." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You're already thinking about what I need beyond just being your wife." "You're more than just my wife," Samuel said seriously. "You're Margaret Reed, writer, thinker, woman of substance. My job is to give you space to be all of that." And there it was, the reason she'd fallen in love with this quiet rancher. Not because he'd rescued her, not because he'd offered shelter, but because he saw her as a whole person with dreams and ambitions beyond just serving his needs. They got up together and made breakfast, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd been working together for weeks. The coffee was strong, the bacon crispy, the eggs perfect. And sitting across from Samuel at the table they'd shared for so long, now as husband and wife instead of uncertain housemates, Margaret felt joy bubble up in her chest. "What are you smiling about?" Samuel asked. "Everything," Margaret said honestly. "I'm smiling about everything." The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, similar to what they'd had before, but different in small, significant ways. They worked the ranch together, planned improvements for spring, talked about maybe getting a few more chickens and possibly a milk cow. Margaret wrote letters to her sister, receiving warm replies that suggested their relationship might heal into something honest and real. Samuel taught Margaret everything he knew about ranching, and she taught him that she had a head for numbers that made their bookkeeping actually make sense. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and read together, or talked, or simply existed in each other's company. Sometimes they discussed serious things, plans for the future, concerns about the ranch, news from town. Sometimes they talked about nothing at all, just filling the space with words because silence, while comfortable, wasn't always necessary. Winter deepened, and Margaret learned what Samuel had meant about the brutal cold. There were days when the wind howled so fiercely they couldn't leave the cabin, days when the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the bucket overnight. But there were also days of crystalline beauty, when the sun made the snow sparkle like diamonds, and the air was so clear you could see for miles. Days when Margaret and Samuel would bundle up and walk the property just to marvel at the stark magnificence of the land they called home. In January, a package arrived from Philadelphia. Margaret's belongings, shipped by her sister as promised. They unpacked it together, and Margaret showed Samuel pieces of her past life. Books she'd collected, photographs of people long gone, small treasures that had survived the journey. Samuel handled each item with care, understanding that these weren't just objects, but pieces of Margaret's story. "Do you miss it?" he asked as they sorted through a box of books. "Philadelphia, I mean, the life you had there." Margaret considered the question seriously. "I miss some things. Good bookstores, certain friends, the convenience of having everything close by. But do I miss the life I had? No. That life had ended long before I left. This—" She gestured around the cabin, at Samuel, at the window showing the Wyoming wilderness. "This is living. The rest was just existing." Spring came slowly, grudgingly, the snow melting in patches to reveal muddy earth beneath. Samuel started the addition to the cabin, and Margaret planted a garden in a sheltered spot near the house. They watched green things push up through the soil with the same wonder people must have felt since the beginning of time, the miracle of growth, of persistence, of life continuing despite everything. Sarah Mitchell visited regularly, often bringing news from town or just coming for coffee and conversation. Dorothy Whitman came once, inspected the ranch with a critical eye, and declared it acceptable, though you could use more chickens. Rebecca Chen brought laundry services, though Margaret suspected she just wanted an excuse to visit and share gossip. And slowly, carefully, Margaret built a community, not just people she knew, but friends, real friends who valued her for who she was. Harold Vaughn left Rollins that spring. Margaret heard about it from Sarah. He'd sold his property and moved to Colorado, hopefully to start fresh and maybe, possibly, learn from his mistakes. Margaret felt no animosity toward him anymore. He'd been a catalyst, not a villain. The man who'd inadvertently pushed her toward the life she was meant to have. On their 6-month anniversary, Samuel came home from town with a letter. "Came to the post office today, from the territorial governor's office." Margaret took it with confusion, breaking the seal and reading quickly. Her eyes widened. "What is it?" Samuel asked. They want to appoint me to the Territorial Education Committee. Apparently Louise Parker recommended me, said I had valuable perspective on education reform." Margaret looked up at Samuel in shock. "They want me to help develop curriculum for rural schools." "That's wonderful." Samuel pulled her into a hug. "See? I told you that you needed an office. You're going to be too busy to just be a rancher's wife." "I'll never be just anything," Margaret said against his chest. "But yes, I think I'd like to do this. Use my experience, make a difference. Is that all right?" "Margaret," Samuel pulled back to look at her seriously, "you don't need my permission to be extraordinary. You just need to decide what you want to do and then do it. I'll support you whatever you choose." So Margaret joined the education committee. She traveled to Cheyenne twice that summer for meetings, staying with Sarah's cousin and immersing herself in policy discussions and curriculum development. She wrote letters to educators across the territory, compiled research, and developed proposals for improving rural education. And she loved it, loved using her mind again, loved contributing to something bigger than just her own life, loved being valued for her intelligence and experience. But she always came home to Samuel and the ranch, and those homecomings were sweet. He'd greet her at the station, take her trunk, and drive her home while she told him everything she'd learned and done. And he'd listen, asking thoughtful questions, offering insights, treating her work as important as his own. The seasons turned. Summer heat gave way to autumn cool, and autumn cool surrendered to winter white. And through it all, Margaret and Samuel built their life together. Not perfect, not easy, but real and rich and deeply satisfying. On the anniversary of the day Margaret had arrived in Rollins, 1 full year since Harold Vaughn had rejected her at that train station, Samuel suggested they take a ride into town. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Humor me." So they rode to Rollins together, and Samuel drove the wagon past the general store, past the church, all the way to the train station. He pulled to a stop at the exact spot where Margaret had stood a year ago, abandoned and uncertain, and facing an unknown future. "Remember this place?" he asked. "I could hardly forget it. This is where I first saw you." Samuel climbed down and helped Margaret down beside him. Standing here with your trunk, looking like you were ready to fight the whole territory if necessary. And I thought, that's someone who doesn't quit. I was terrified, Margaret admitted. You were magnificent. He took both her hands. Margaret Reed, in the past year you've defended our home, built a community, joined a territorial committee, and somehow managed to put up with me through all of it. You've made me happier than I have any right to be, and you've shown me that 58 isn't an ending, it's just another beginning. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Why are we here, Samuel? Because I wanted you to see how far you've come, wanted you to stand in this spot and remember the woman who got off that train, and then realize how much you've grown since then. He smiled. And because I wanted to tell you, in the place where it all started, that I love you more every day. That marrying you was the smartest thing I ever did. That I can't wait to see what the next 50 years bring. 50 years? Margaret laughed through her tears. Samuel Reed, I'm 59 years old. I don't think I have 50 years left. Then we'll make the most of however many we get, he said firmly. Whether it's 5 years or 50, we'll fill them with everything that matters. Work and laughter and quiet evenings by the fire and occasionally terrifying adventures that we survived together. Margaret pulled him close and kissed him there on the platform where Harold Vaughn had rejected her, where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. And she understood, finally and completely, what home really meant. Home wasn't a place or a building or even a person. Home was the feeling of being exactly where you belonged, doing exactly what you were meant to do, with exactly the right person beside you. She'd traveled 800 miles looking for a fresh start, and she'd found so much more. She'd found purpose and partnership and a love that had nothing to do with youth or beauty or any of the shallow things people claimed mattered. She'd found a love built on respect and trust and the daily choice to keep showing up for each other. Take me home, Margaret said against Samuel's lips. Already there, he replied. Been there since the day you stepped off that train. They drove back to the ranch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple. The cabin came into view over the rise, smoke curling from the chimney, light glowing in the windows. Their home, built together, filled with the life they'd chosen. Margaret looked at the ring on her finger, Samuel's mother's ring, worn smooth by time and love, and thought about all the different kinds of wealth in the world. Money, beauty, youth, those were the things people chased, but the real treasure was this, someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. Someone who gave you space to grow and roots to hold you steady. Someone who turned a house into a home and a name into an identity. That night, they sat by the fire like they did every night. Margaret with her correspondence for the education committee, Samuel with his ranch records. The work was never done, but somehow that felt right. Life wasn't about reaching some perfect endpoint where everything was finished. Life was about the journey, the daily choice to keep building, keep growing, keep loving. Margaret? Samuel said eventually. Thank you. She looked up from her papers. For what? For getting on that train. For having the courage to cross the country on a broken promise. For being too stubborn to give up when things went wrong. He smiled. For choosing me when you could have chosen safety. This is safety, Margaret said softly. Real safety isn't about avoiding risk. It's about facing it with someone you trust. She set down her pen and crossed to where he sat, settling onto his lap like she'd done it 1,000 times before. I love you, Samuel Reed. And I'd get on that train again, knowing everything I know now because it brought me here. To you. To us. He wrapped his arms around her and they sat together in the firelight, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something real from nothing, who'd learned that love wasn't about beginnings. It was about finding someone who kept the door open when winter wouldn't stop knocking. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the land in white. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. And Margaret Reed, née Ellis, once rejected, once lost, now found, closed her eyes and let herself feel the full weight of contentment. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And that, she thought as sleep pulled her under, was more than enough. It was everything.